This week on Ahead of Their Time, it's the two women who invented the double-handed backhand.
I couldn't hold it and release it, so I just started using a double-handed backhand.
He was way too pushy. He used to say to the kids who lived in Hamtramck, you don't win, you don't eat.
We probably brought it to the masses. It was like an epidemic of two-handed backhands after a while.
Check out Ahead of Their Time right now in the Hot Takedown feed. You can find that in the ESPN app or wherever you get your podcasts.
Hello, and welcome to the 538 Elections Podcast. My name is Jody Avirgan. Donald Trump is our president-elect, a stunning turn in American politics and society, and that is the word that I'm left with today. Stunned and honestly somewhat numb, both intellectually and emotionally. But I just want to add for people who are listening that, there isn't really any right way to feel in moments like this. You should honor whatever your reaction is: stunned, angry, sad, vindicated, resolute. And I know that there's a swirl of reactions in this room as well. So here we are in this studio, and we're not going to accomplish everything in this show, our first show after the election. I've never in my life had this many questions, big and small, in my head swirling around. But part of me does feel like this is a time for questions more than answers. And I'm glad I have these colleagues here with me to help start the discussion. So, Editor-in-Chief Nate Silver, hello.
Hey.
Fry Shadea, hi there.
Hey, folks.
Politics reporter Claire Malone.
Hey, Jody.
And whiz kid Harry Enton, hello, Harry. I have, as I said, a number of questions, big and small, about polling and themes and all sorts of stuff. But Nate, do you want to just kick things off? What's on your mind?
Boy.
Yeah.
Sometimes things come together in a way that a number of things have to come together, but all these things were foreseeable. This kind of scenario is something that we spent a lot of time warning people about, this exact scenario.
So can you just describe
A split, great.
Yeah, so describe exactly how you evaluate the way last night played out.
Hillary Clinton did not have that large a lead in the polls. She had a lead of about 3.5 percentage points nationally. And furthermore, she was underperforming in the average swing state. So in the swing states, it was the equivalent of about a 2 or 2.5 point polling lead. Remember, all these swing states that Obama won in 2012, like Ohio and Iowa, Clinton was underperforming, and in fact the polls overrated her performance the most in the Midwest. But when you have a 3.5 point polling lead, when you have problems in the Electoral College, and this is not after the fact analysis, this is something we talked about and explained consistently based on where her coalition of voters is, which is on the coast. She's going to win California by 28 points, which Obama won by 24, right? She's going to lose Texas by 9 points, which Obama lost by 18 or something, right? She made gains in Arizona, becoming a high population state. None of those help her one iota in the Electoral College, where she lost Iowa by 10 points or something, right? And this was clear based on the polling going in, that if you had a shift of even 2 points toward Trump, that Clinton could be in trouble. And that's what it is. I mean, Clinton's going to wind up winning when the California votes are counted, the popular vote, by a point-ish, maybe a point and a half. The national polling average had her up 3.5 or 4 points. That's a pretty ordinary polling error. And so, first of all, I said this after Brexit, right? The people whose first instinct is to blame the polls when there was so much smugness from the commentariat, certainly on parts of the left and the center left, and to some extent on the right too, and a lot of kind of Beltway centrist pundits, right? The polls were less wrong than the conventional wisdom in New York and Washington about Donald Trump's chances.
I think we will circle back to the polls, and certainly in future shows we'll do that, and there's lots of strands to pull. But I do want to kind of get all the puzzle pieces of this collective group on the table first. So, Claire, big or small, polling, not polling, what are you thinking about?
Just talking about the Electoral College popular vote split, someone on Twitter pointed this out, which is that the Electoral College was created in order to give rural voters, rural white voters in the, back in the day, a voice on par with more urban areas, right? It is the same idea as the Senate balancing out the House, proportional representation. And that's what happened last night, quite literally. You saw surges of rural voters in a lot of states. Michigan had a lot more rural voters turning out, and those people far and away were voting for Trump. So that's the thing that I was watching. I think the idea that college education has just turned into, it's the Grand Canyon. It's how you see, it is the number one demarcation of how you view America. And if you do not have a college education, you probably were more likely to vote for Donald Trump last night. And if you do have a college education, you might be flabbergasted this morning at the result. But I don't think anyone on either side can say that they, with the exception of maybe Bill Mitchell.
Bill
Mitchell is never going away. Everyone is stunned, I think. And I think that's the big takeaway.
Fry?
Well, yeah, I don't think everyone is stunned. But I think I was not one of these people who saw this coming. But I do think there was a lot of talk about the enthusiasm gap and looking at crowds. But there were also polls that showed that more, and I can't pull one up right now, but showed that more of Trump's voters were stans, in the kind of fan parlance, that they were just all in, whereas a lot of Clinton voters were strategic voters. And I do think in the end that made a difference.
I still will say that I do think even the Trump campaign and a lot of people thought they were underdogs coming in last night. I guess that's what I mean, is that this was a very they were running, in the way that people like an underdog, people like the Cubs, right?
Right, but I'm actually not talking
that's
about.
What we knew when the Cubs.
I'm not talking about the Trump campaign per se, but the people who I met in Warren, Ohio, believed very deeply in their hearts that they could swing the election. And you can just call that local organizers. But if you multiply, the level of, I went to interview people at the Mocha House in Warren, Ohio, and one woman showed up wearing an outfit that was a black sweater with gold embroidered elephants all over it, elephant earrings, et cetera, et cetera. That's what I mean by a stan, and that's not a slur. That's a pop culture term. It just means somebody who is all in. I did not see that when I interviewed Clinton voters.
Harry?
Well, I'm going to say, a few things that are sort of on my mind. I think we're going to have to wait for all of the results to come in to fully digest why what happened. I think that from a mathematical standpoint, this is not shocking. We wrote many pieces that suggested that the types of polling error that were needed to allow Donald Trump to win were certainly plausible and very possible based upon history. But I think that a lot of people who probably listen to this podcast, even if they understood the mathematical possibilities, couldn't wrap their heads around the actual error occurring. And those are two very different things. I think there's going to be a lot of talk about white voters in rural areas. I'll also point out, if you look at the state of Michigan and you look at Wayne County, if Hillary Clinton got the same turnout in Wayne County, that's Detroit, that Barack Obama did, she would have won that state. She would have won it barely, but she would have won it. And I think that when we review the results, although there was a surge of white voters in rural areas, white voters without a college degree going for Donald Trump, I think Clinton got lower turnout from African Americans most likely, and even if just on the margin, she probably did a little bit worse than he did. And that combined with the higher white non-college vote for Donald Trump, I think ended up swinging the election.
When the leaked media exit polls that everyone sees and no one talks about came out, they showed a Clinton landslide. They showed her beating her polls by a couple of points across the board. There's been work, Nate Cohn at the New York Times did work about how these exit polls have trouble capturing the minority electorate, right? And to me, it seems very dubious to conclude from those exit polls that Clinton's problems were with black people and brown people. Yes, with turnout, but in terms of people actually changing their votes. And the exit polls did not just show a lower turnout, they showed Trump getting a larger share of the vote, right? And President Obama did so well that that's maybe not that surprising, I suppose. But still, a data source that was so dubious. And the polls, like I said before, were not that bad overall, but they definitely had huge trouble picking up on demographic changes and shifts, and they understated them, actually.
That's actually, I did a BBC interview today, and I said, I don't know exactly how the numbers in advance were wrong. Was it a change in the density of different voting populations? Was it that the polls were off entirely? I'd love to know, because I really don't. Polling is not really my universe. I use it as a tool, but I don't completely understand it. So what do you think?
I think, first of all, it's challenging to actually reach voters today. And these pollsters have low response rates. That's been an issue for a long time. And what I think pollsters tend to do in a case like that is assume stasis, right? Where you assume that if we see a big shift, that means we did something wrong in our poll, and therefore you come up with assumptions that tend to soften that shift, right? If you see Trump winning in Iowa by 7 points, which the last Des Moines Register poll did, because Ann Seltzer will give you her numbers even if they're politically incorrect, so to speak, right? You say, oh, you know what? Republicans don't usually win in Iowa by 7 points, especially when the Democrats are going to win the popular vote nationally. Therefore, let's make a different assumption about turnout, and therefore we'll have Trump 2 points ahead, right? Or Ohio, I think there were a lot of those. Because the directionality, where you begin to see these shifts, the polls sort of identified, right? Where at the same time that Michigan and Pennsylvania were too close to call last night, so were Georgia and Arizona, for example. So the directionality was kind of, they were picking up on something, but they actually dulled it somehow, right? I think by, a lot of pollsters say, well, voters don't really change their minds. The electorate's always the same. Just project Clinton +3. And they rely too much on the prior from the previous election. And then when you have change happens all at once.
I want to go back a little bit to something you said, Claire, and Harry jump in on this too. Whether it's from a numbers perspective or just from a watching the state of our democracy perspective, this gulf that you mentioned, and you brought it up when it comes to education, but a lot of people are talking about a gulf between white voters and non-white voters and gender and class, and obviously they're all related. This was my main kind of growing and sinking feeling last night watching it, regardless of who was going to win, just seeing the gulf that exists in this country between different groups widening seemingly. Yeah.
I mean, America, the economics of this are, I think, getting a lot more clear about who feels like, we've talked about this, that Trump supporters aren't necessarily worse off economically than, certain ones of Clinton supporters. But it is this idea that if you are in a geographic region, essentially, that feels like things aren't looking good for your kids, you're not optimistic. And that's class and culture. You feel like the Democratic Party of today doesn't understand your cultural space, basically. I do think that the big gulf that we'll talk about is gender and within gender. So there was a huge gender gap, meaning that since 1976, more women went for Clinton, more men went for Trump. But within the women's subset, women without a college education, white women without a college education voted for Trump. White women with a college education voted for Clinton. So we see, again, within gender, it's not, it's a fractured sisterhood, right? Like, this is not just everyone's excited about the first female president. There's a real partisan divide in this country. And a lot of Democrats who were leaning Trump this election I talked to, quite a few of them voted for Obama. And I don't know, Obama captured something perhaps because he was a more attractive candidate. He was better at it. And a lot of people were inspired by that moment. A lot of people were not inspired by Hillary Clinton. We're not inspired by the notion of a female president.
We'll have days and weeks and months to exactly figure out what occurred. But, kind of reminded a little bit of the 2000 campaign, where a lot of people thought that Al Gore made a mistake by going populist in the last few days and going to places like Michigan, going to places like Wisconsin with a populist message. Well, we're now 16 years later after the fact, and a lot of people made fun of Donald Trump for going to places like Michigan, going to places like Minnesota, where none of the polls had the race close, and Trump ends up losing by only about a percentage point. And it does seem that perhaps we're not as much of a conservative versus liberal country as much as we are a country in which the center or some form of the center wants a politician to speak to the economic pain that they feel themselves or feel that the country is going through. And that, to me, is the most interesting thing about this. If you go back 4 years ago, Romney was painted as the out-of-touch millionaire. And in this particular election, despite the fact that Donald Trump, whether you like him or not, does actually have, I believe, a higher net worth than Mitt Romney, somehow was able to portray himself as the candidate of the working-class white. And it does seem to have paid off. And Hillary Clinton just did not make this about economics. She made it about that Trump is a guy who you can't trust with your finger on the button. And so, we're gonna have some time to digest.
Yes, but I'm just trying to get a sense. I know it's early, and I know this is all related. I know it's not this simple, but of lenses through which to process this. So we've talked about education. We've talked about, I guess geography is a lens. We've talked about gender, but race, whiteness. I feel like we have to talk about that. It feels like white voters voted as a cohesive bloc, and they voted for a candidate whose main gamble was to activate white voters in that way and make a mathematical gamble that white voters would unite and vote on a grievance ticket and be able to pull off an incredibly narrow mathematical gambit. And it worked.
I have two different sets of feelings about this. I think after having interviewed the people I have, some of them I think were motivated by race and xenophobia, and some of them I feel very strongly were not. But what is coming up is, can you put yourself in someone else's shoes? America is no longer a place that feels safe to most people of color. And I remember going to Thomasville, Georgia, just north of the Florida border, and reporting on a story about a white church that wanted to dig up the body of a mixed-race infant because it was essentially polluting their graveyard. And I just rolled on up to the church and sat in the back of the pew and ambushed the pastor. And I saw the black people there, and I met the white people there. And if I lived there, I would not feel safe. So it's well and dandy for me to go get a coffee in Brooklyn that costs $6. But what's going to happen to the people in the little black hamlet outside the white trailer park? I'm not being nicey nice. I'm just being real. And there's a lot of places in America where people will feel measurably less safe. Violence against Muslim Americans rose by 72% since Donald Trump started running for president. Some studies have shown that words are behind that rise. People feel permission. People who, not everyone wants to act out racially, but people who do feel they have permission. I mean, white people did largely vote as a bloc in different ways, not everyone, as we've discussed. But I'm more curious in the thought process. Did you think your vote was going to hurt other people? Did you care? I think some people do care very deeply, and they think that Donald Trump will be better for everyone.
I mean, the degree to which, my favorite metaphor for this is that even within the 5 boroughs of New York City, you see this polarization where Trump got fewer votes than Romney in Manhattan, dropped from 15% of the GOP vote to 10%, but Trump won in a landslide in Staten Island, which I think partly because of the effects of Hurricane Sandy, President Obama won 4 years ago. So it's like you just have to cross take the ferry to Staten Island to see in some ways how liberals kind of concentrate themselves in these urban enclaves with very tall buildings and kind of very narrow, in a way, demographics. And I think there's a lot of thinking to do about, first of all, it happens to be electorally disadvantageous.
Very much so.
But, people aren't really talking to one another. And Democrats don't have a message that speaks to people over big swaths of the country.
It is so easy the day afterwards, and I am guilty of this as well, to try and find some, clear message of what's going on. And to me, though, the thing you need to take away is politics is cyclical. Politics is cyclical. We are always looking for
and Obama said that in his speech.
Exactly. We are always looking for the reason why things occurred. But the fact is, people just sometimes want a change, and that occurs very regularly. Go back. In 1992, Democrats were able to get all three, the presidency, the Senate, and the House. 2002, the Republicans controlled all three. 2008, the Democrats controlled all three. 2016, now the Republicans control all three. We're going to have a midterm election in 2 years. If history goes the way that we think it's going to go, and maybe history should be tossed out the window in some sense, we'll see Democrats gain, and we'll go, oh, my God, the Republicans are deep trouble.
I think a big story for Democrats is going to be, how did you lose this natural constituency? Union voters. I mean, we use that broad term to describe essentially blue-collar whites in the Midwest where she collapsed last night. That's a natural constituency for Democrats, and I think that there is a lot of alienation, quite frankly. And, listen, I know our listenership. We have a lot of liberals who listen to us. I'm guessing there are a lot of people who live in big cities. But issues of culture, as much as you might dislike it, gay marriage, talking about transgender politics, that stuff isn't a natural inclination for a lot of people. A lot of people are learning how to talk about it, how to understand it. And there's part of me that thinks, from Ohio, like I'm traveling around, I talked to a woman who said, everything that was wrong when I was a kid is right now. So what she was saying was, you can have premarital sex and no one cares. You can be out as a gay person and no one cares. And to her, those were things that were problematic. The moral center was shifting for her. And she was in a heavily Trump county that went for Obama twice. There is a real feeling for people that morality, the fundamental building blocks of an American life, are different. And that is hard, I think, for liberal urbanites to hear, people that I socialize with, right? This, I mean, this is, we all have biases, and this is where I live. That is a huge problem for the Democratic Party. I mean, and it is a historic constituency, and you're going to hear, people like Mike Pence and Paul Ryan came out of those households, right? Irish Catholic Midwestern households. They're sort of two emblematic people that pop right to my mind of a certain, perhaps older generation, but that's, I don't know, it's really shifting. And I think that's the thing that Democrats are going to figure out.
Yeah, someone said this phrase. They said, bringing facts to a culture war is like bringing a knife to a gunfight.
Yeah.
That's going to stick with me.
Yeah.
The Clinton campaign also made a calculation that we can run on fumes and we'll have just enough to get us over the finish line. And that calculation was almost correct. I don't mean to dwell on it. They are going to win the popular vote, and they lost a lot of states by a point or less, I think enough to swing the Electoral College.
Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin.
And they had a bad 2 weeks of the campaign at the end that was somewhat due to the FBI story and things that were somewhat out of their control, right? And when you calculate just barely getting over the finish line, if you make one miscalculation, all of a sudden you pull up short. But not just the campaign. I mean, broadly speaking, what new ideas did you hear from Hillary Clinton? I mean, I covered the campaign for a year and a half. I can't tell you, some family sick leave. I can tell you one promise she made about what she'd actually do if she was elected president, right? Minimum wage, stuff she made was stuff to mollify Bernie Sanders supporters, actually, and not stuff that was kind of part of what does Hillary Clinton want to do for the country. I
mean, their campaign would argue that they were never given the breathing room to be able to do that, and that they wanted the space to do that. And
but they ran a very defensive, prevent defense type of campaign.
It's hard. I mean, look, I'm just saying it's hard not to play defense when the other side is always on your side of the court playing,
But I mean, part of it was
7 seconds or less or whatever.
They were also running in the legacy of a very popular American president. They thought that was the most sensible thing, right? Stand behind those policies. Whereas Kellyanne Conway, she singled out reports of Obamacare premiums going up as like a perfect campaign moment for them, perfectly timed. It was something that, I mean, and you have to say, like Bill Clinton said something, Obamacare is not perfect, we've got to fix it.
Yeah.
But there was this sense for people that like this is here, a couple weeks before the election is something that is a palpable policy thing.
I'll just add, I don't have the answers. I clearly don't think about this stuff as deeply as you guys, but to me that sounds like a lot of retroactive pointing to actual policy moments and saying, oh, that was a turning point, when in the entire campaign was not. I mean, we remember when that moment came up. They did not capitalize on it. Donald Trump sent maybe one tweet, and then they went back to racial grievance
voters
politics.
Care about it. Voters talk about Obamacare. Like, I mean, small businesses talk about Obamacare premiums. It is a thing.
But it is, and it's an interesting question to think about, is whether there were some of these moments, as Nate was pointing out, as you were pointing out, that actually mattered, or whether, to me, it felt like a much more one-note campaign. I just don't want to normalize retroactively the Donald Trump campaign.
I'm not talking about the campaign, though. I mean, I think Conway's a pollster, right? Pardon my French, but like a lot of Republican voters could give a flying what Trump says on Twitter. He's tweeted a lot of bad things, but if you're talking about if you're a person who's sort of like tepid about Trump and you see your premiums go up, sure, that's a thing that could sway you towards the Republican side of things. I don't think I think that's an issue thing.
Yeah, and let me just mention that last night at 4 a.m. as I was leaving the ABC Digital Studios, I met a guy named Justin Rodriguez who was carrying a Trump banner down the street in Times Square, and he is Latino, his girlfriend is Muslim American. They both voted for Trump, and he cited Obamacare as one of the reasons. Conversely, when I was in Ohio for the convention, I went to a rock show that was billed as the Anarchist National Convention, headlined by Ministry, and they were amazing. But long story short, I met a white working class woman whose husband or boyfriend was wearing a Harley Davidson cut-off sleeve T-shirt. And she was like, I have nothing bad to say about Obamacare. I work at a bar, and as long as I pay my premiums, and they're not very much, I have health insurance. I have nothing bad to say about it. So why MMV?
Let's leave it there, and I want to do one more round just of looking forward to what we're wanting to report. But first, a word from this show's sponsors. Today's podcast is brought to you by ShipStation. When you're online, your customer reviews can make or break your business. So it's important to keep your customers happy by shipping out your orders quickly. That's why you need ShipStation. When you're using Shopify, Squarespace, Etsy, BigCommerce, or wherever you sell online, ShipStation automatically imports your orders into one easy-to-use interface, making them really easy to manage. Then you can use ShipStation to quickly and easily create shipping labels for all the top carriers and get the lowest rate for every package. Right now, try ShipStation for free for 30 days and get an additional month free when you sign up. Go to ShipStation.com/elections. Don't wait. Right now, go to ShipStation.com/elections. Today's podcast is also brought to you by MeUndies. Think about it. Underwear is the first thing you put on and the last thing you take off each day. Why would you settle for anything less than the best feeling underwear on the planet? MeUndies focuses solely on producing the most comfortable underwear you've ever experienced. Try them on, and if they aren't the most comfortable, best feeling undies you've ever had, they'll refund you and let you keep your first pair for free. These super comfortable underwear are only sold on the MeUndies website, where you'll enjoy free shipping in the U.S. and Canada. For a limited time, everyone listening gets 20% off their first order when you go to the URL MeUndies.com/elections. That's MeUndies.com/elections right now for 20% off your first order. Okay, we're back, and maybe we'll start to wrap up. But as I mentioned at the top of the show, I feel like this is a time for questions as much as it is for answers. So maybe we can just talk a bit about some of the questions, big or small, that we want to dig into next. So, Harry, you want to kick us off?
I got an email a few days ago from Sean Trende, who's over at Real Clear Politics, and he essentially asked, wait, doesn't it seem strange that Donald Trump is leading by 7 in Iowa, but is trailing by 6 in Wisconsin? Doesn't that seem a little bit wide? I know that, maybe Wisconsin is perhaps a slight touch more liberal than the state of Iowa, but they're right next to each other, and demographically they're really similar. Well, it turns out it was a bit too much. It was a bit wide. And Iowa, the result was fairly close to +7 for Donald Trump. It was a little higher than that. But in Wisconsin, obviously, the result was significantly bit more Republican. We had known for a while that Iowa had becoming more red. What was sort of weird was, why wasn't Wisconsin showing the same thing in the polls? So, there were the breadcrumbs that were there. But I don't think there was anybody who really looked at data who thought that Donald Trump was going to win. But I think what we need to understand, I thought we did a decent enough job of it, but perhaps we could have done a better job of it, was even though Hillary Clinton was the favorite, and if you looked at the data, you had to conclude that, to ensure that people understand what probabilities really mean. And they mean that things can actually occur when it's the 30% or the 25% of the time. It's just that we have had a limited run with this type of data stuff, and it's something we're going to have to work on in the future, I think.
Claire?
Well, my designated beat is now, how did this happen?
Isn't that everyone's designated beat?
I guess that, for me, has for the past few months referred to the Republican Party.
Mm-hmm.
And I am interested to see how... I don't know what it looks like in Washington 2 months from now. I think it'll be interesting to see what happens with Paul Ryan, with the leadership, how they handle sort of Trump's slightly blank canvas as far as policies go. And I also think it will be fascinating to watch the Democrats and while they figure out which direction to go in.
I think it's important to remember how much interpretations of events shift based on very small changes, right? If Clinton had 1% more of the vote nationally and Trump had 1% fewer, so 1 out of 100 people changing from Trump to Clinton, people would say, oh, the polls basically got it right. There are definitely some problems in the Midwest, and it's kind of weird that she won but lost Ohio and Iowa by so much. But this is basically what we expected to happen, and this proves that the liberal coalition is on the ascendancy, and it proves that Trump lost a very winnable election. So we should have some dose of that measured opinion today, and in the alternate world where Clinton wins, we should have some dose of the fact that she was probably going to almost lose, right? That you just took away a few votes, and oh my gosh, maybe we have a recount in Michigan and she wins in this alternate reality when she would have lost or something otherwise. It's the same country that voted for Donald Trump, Barack Obama, George W. Bush, and Bill Clinton. Hard to think of 4 more different leadership styles, and one is always a counter reaction to the other, right? It's the same country. I don't know. I just think that once it became clear that Clinton, I guess it wasn't clear because there was risk on either side, but once it became clear-ish that it was going to be a close-ish election probably in one direction or the other, you were not going to have some overwhelming 8 or 10 point mandate for Clinton where you saw Democrats overtaking the House, right? Then the lessons about what it means for the country were slightly baked in, that there is a fairly big market for Donald Trump's populist rhetoric, that there's maybe a more limited market for contemporary center-left liberalism. We were dismissive of Bernie Sanders for the reason that people always overrated his electoral chances against Clinton. There was a lot of wishful thinking. But in terms of a portent for what it meant for the country and how much trouble Clinton had, she lost voters under 29 80-20 in a lot of parts of the country. She lost African-American and Hispanic millennials to Bernie Sanders in a lot of parts of the country. It didn't make the Democratic primary all that close, but, kind of Clintonism lived out its usefulness, and Democrats need something different, and both parties merit watching. I don't know what's going to, I think that the left in the country, the Bernie Sanders left, kind of comes out looking the best from this, right? At least they haven't screwed up yet, I don't agree with all those policies, but at least they haven't had a chance to screw up yet, and so I kind of think that, that's where the energy is going to be on the Democratic Party for now, and you're going to have a very fascinating 2020 primary. Let's be honest, there's also a pretty good chance of a Trump presidency that goes wrong, and you could have a 2020 Republican primary. You could have third-party candidates. So for people who are following politics, it's a fascinating time, but I don't know. Yeah. I guess I have so many thoughts I can't really...
At what cost is my question for this fascination.
But people voted. People did vote for this guy.
Yeah.
Right? People did, and that's partly why I think Democrats felt like maybe there's going to be rioting and everything will come apart. But, the one thing about a democracy is that if someone wins, and yes, the Electoral College is an important qualification to this, as, by the way, is voter suppression, and I hope Democrats take a lot of look at that, right? A lot of look at that. But the fact is that the country voted for this guy, right?
Yeah.
But the
It's
ramifications, as Farai put it earlier, for particular groups, and frankly groups that aren't always well represented in this room, are ones that we really need to consider. Again, I just don't want to make it seem like this was a normal election where a normal person is becoming president, and there are normal consequences from that.
After Brexit, there were some columnists that said, if you accept democracy, then you have to accept the results that you don't like, right? So argue against democracy if you want. Argue for an elitocracy or whatever else, right? But, like,
I think that you are right, Jody, and that Farai brings up a really good point, that people who are black people, Muslims living in parts of the country that are majority white have a right to be afraid for the future and how people will act towards them. I hope better angels will prevail in most parts of that. But I will also point out, I mean, yeah, he won the election. Leadership doesn't just happen within the political structure within elected office. I think there is maybe some white people will have greater sympathy for feeling, gobsmacked by the system. I mean, someone on Twitter was Maggie, one of our colleagues, posted what I thought was a really poignant Twitter essay, basically from a black man who I think is a lawyer somewhere in New York, that just said, welcome to how minorities feel every day, which is sort of like they're disappointed by the system. The system has disappointed them, right? The idea that, I think a lot of Democrats are probably feeling like they don't trust the process.
Fry, what are your reactions to this, and then also your question going forward?
One reaction is that no system is pure. American capitalism is not purely capitalist, it's partly oligarchic. And American democracy is influenced by the media, which, all the free attention Trump got without the scrutiny, who knows who we would have had as the nominee if things had been different, and this was documented. But what I'm really looking at is a story I've wanted to do for a long time on cognitive science, because what we're left with is why we make the decisions we do. And they explain why we act in fearful ways at certain times. And I think we cannot underestimate fear and anger as motivators for this election. We cannot begin to understand this election until we understand how we think and how someone in their own cognitive processes may think that they are doing the right thing and do it without regarding all the other actors in the system. We have to go deep inside ourselves, and we are pretty close to cavemen and women in terms of our biology and our neurology. And that is something that I feel is quite important. And it's not a slur against humans. We evolved as best we can so far, and if we don't extinct ourselves, we'll keep evolving. But right now, we're kind of cavemen.
I guess I've been thinking about this guy I talked to who was a Black Lives Matter protester in Charlotte, who's one of the most thoughtful, eloquent people I've ever talked to. And he's a guy who's he's a camera operator there, but was just, sort of stopped on his way home from work at this protest. He said to me, every republic has failed before America because of the lack of the civic virtue. Civic virtue gets zapped by the institutions that are created to keep the citizens in line. And he talked about, that the system advances just a few, and it makes certain people feel uncomfortable. It makes certain people feel safe and secure. And he went on and said, this country isn't based on parties and political ideals. We live under a moral code that's supposed to join us all. It doesn't mean we all think the same, to Farai's point, but we have the same interests. We have different ways to get there. And
this guy told you this on the street?
Yeah, I mean, we were sitting in a bar. Gosh. I mean, he was one of those
saying go.
Yeah,
he is sadly not. But I sat there listening to him for an hour and a half and talking about the idea of democracy, and it was everything he said was quotable and interesting, and was about institutions and how people don't trust them, and how white people didn't understand how black people felt in Charlotte, but the first person who bailed him out of jail when he was arrested as a protester was, as he put it, a white Republican who he'd worked with at his job. So that's sort of what I was trying to get to earlier, which is that I don't know how that feels, but I think I'll let Braxton Winston speak for himself. But
and what I would also say is that I have faith in humanity, and I have faith in America, and We don't always get it right, but we still have come a long way, and it's sort of like the Proustian spiral, where you keep going in circles, but you keep moving upward. And sometimes you get tired of walking around the mountain, but you eventually get to where you're going.
All right. On that note, but we're going to keep having these conversations. These conversations are really important to me.
Therapy sessions?
And therapy sessions, big think conversations, political science, rethinks, polling, analysis. I've got my little list of conversations that I want to have about the state of polling, our model, the state of our democracy, the stuff that Claire just brought up about the divide between different groups. And then we're going to have to talk about the transition to a Trump presidency, an evaluation of the Obama years. So there's a lot to get into over the coming weeks, and we're going to do this at least through inauguration. But like I said, I'm glad I have you guys.
Thank you, Jody.
We're glad to have you.
Yeah.
And I want to thank everyone here for just, it's not easy trying to remain an observer. And when I spoke to one of the people who I interviewed for the Voters series, I just said, thank you for talking to me. Talking to reporters is a crapshoot, and you never know what you'll get. And she hadn't contacted me after I wrote the piece, but she was glad to be a part of it. I don't think everyone I interviewed was, but I always try to be fair. And this is exhausting work. And I have to thank the Americans who've spoken to us and the people who've come up with the data that we use. Thanks.
Yeah.
All right. Back to work. Nate Silver, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Claire Malone.
Thank you, Jody.
Harry Enton.
Love you, buddy.
Thank you, Farai.
Hugs.
All right. We'll leave it there. My name is Jody Avirgan. Galen Druk is our producer. Micah Cohen is 538's politics editor. Tony Chow, Andrew Wagner, and Jorge Estrada are in the control room. Get in touch. Our email address is podcast@538.com. You can also, of course, tweet at us with questions or comments about the show. Thank you for listening. Really, thank you for listening. And we'll see you soon.
USC heads to Seattle to face fourth-ranked Washington.
Far left side of the field for the end zone. Jump ball, Darius Rogers. Touchdown, USC.
Coverage begins Saturday at 7 Eastern on ESPN Radio and the ESPN app.